All right, stand by, guys. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Ariane Aramburo here at our digital desk with Alaska's News Source. So we want to thank you guys for joining us on our live streaming here. We're going to be talking about invasive species. So this week is Invasive Species Awareness Week here in Alaska. Joining me to talk about this a little bit more, I'm going to bring them in. We have Gino Graziano with the University of Alaska Fairbanks Cooperative Extension Service, Terrestrial Invasive Plans, and we also have Kate Mohat, U.S. Forest Service ecologist. Both of you, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Good morning.
Yep.
Good morning.
All right, Kate, I'm going to start with you. Can you just tell folks, because when you hear the word invasive species, it sounds a little like, oh my gosh, what is that? So can you kind of break it down and let folks know what is an invasive species?
Sure. An invasive species is a non-native species, a species that didn't formally occur here, was introduced from a place. And while we have a non-native species in our gardens that we frequently plant in the spring, they don't rise to the level of invasive unless they start causing economic or environmental harm to our native species.
And Gino, is there anything that you want to kind of add to that as well? I'm going to be talking with both of you about some different invasive species that we see here in Alaska.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that Kate hit on is that once they reach that level of being invasive, when they actually cause that economic or environmental harm, there's really very few introduced species that actually get to that point. Even things that are sometimes casually spreading, the stuff you see on the edges of your driveway and in kind of unmanaged areas of your home landscape aren't necessarily invasive. It starts to get to where those species that impact habitat for moose or agricultural production or berry production, things like that.
Kate, talk a little bit about the continued study and detection of invasive Alodia. This was on the Kenai Peninsula, I believe. Can you, one, first explain what Alodia is, and also, two, how that falls into an invasive species?
Absolutely. So Alodia was first discovered in the state. It's Alaska's first aquatic invasive plant. And it was first discovered in Eyak Lake out of Cordova in the early 1980s. It wasn't clear if it was a native or non-native species at that time. We've since learned that it is an introduced species. We have at least species of Alodia that have been introduced to the state. And that was about 15 years ago that discovery's been made. It's since been found in the Fairbanks area on the Kenai Peninsula. In the Matsu Valley, I think we're up to some 29 infestations plus across the state. And our newest infestation, unfortunately, we discovered in Crescent Lake on the Kenai Peninsula last fall. We don't know how long that infestation's been there. This was a lake that's been on our new monitoring plan and hadn't been surveyed for Alodia before. So that's the latest introduction to the state.
Also, Gino, choke cherry trees. Now, I know we've done stories. We actually have done stories about all of these, like what we talked about, the Alodia. Tracy Sinclair, I know, has been big on kind of touching on some of this stuff. So, Gino, if you want to kind of mention about choke cherry trees and how that is an invasive species here to Alaska.
Yeah. So choke cherry trees were something we planted ornamentally, all with really good intentions, starting back in the 1950s, and every agency, including the university, promoted them. They have pretty flowers, attract birds, and they generally aren't damaged by moose. They've since spread, though. We started noticing them in big numbers in the early 2000s in the Anchorage forests, and folks have been finding them in other forests as well. And the reason they're typically not damaged by moose is they actually contain some cyanide in them. Typically, moose aren't going to eat them in the forest, so it reduces the amount of forage that's actually available for them, especially in winter. Fish and Game has documented some poisonings of moose from eating these trees in people's yards and things like that. So that it's something that's of big concern for moose habitat, but also it creates this really dense vegetation layer that keeps a lot of things from growing underneath it that you would normally see. Dogwoods, currants, high bush cranberries. When we get infestations like what you're seeing in this camera film roll right now, those things aren't usually present.
And, people who are coming to visit in Alaska, you'd think summertime we have a huge influx of tourism. And I'll pose this question for both of you. Gino, I'll start with you. What can people do to kind of be on the lookout for this? If folks are out hiking, Alaskans are big recreational outdoor folks. So how do you know if you're coming across an invasive species? Because it just kind of seems like it's, outdoors is so vast. What can Alaskans do to kind of bring awareness to invasive species that are here in the States?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So one thing I would point folks to is to visit a website called alaskainvasives.org. And that's a website that's hosted by UAF in support of the Alaska Invasive Species Partnership. And we have within there some links to ways that you can actually report invasive species to us that you find. A lot of things in urban areas and things like that we generally know about, but it's more once we start seeing things in the backcountry, Chugach National Forest, parks, various national parks throughout the state, wildlife refuges, and in aquatic systems that those are some of the real important little nuggets. And we have other ways to help people see what invasive species are present. There's some links on those websites. There's an app called Alaska Invasives ID that goes through quite a few different species and kind of gives you some generalities of what they look like and where they might be.
Thanks, Gino. And Kate, I'll pose that same question to you. Anything that you want to kind of mention or add or piggyback onto that?
Yeah, I'll add to the part where you don't really have to be a plant taxonomist to know what's invasive and what's native to be able to prevent the spread of new introductions. Just especially for aquatic environments, we have a lot of plants that can grow very thickly in water, and just a good practice is to make sure your boats, your props, your waders, anytime you're moving from different water bodies, you're making sure that you don't have any hanging vegetation or any hitchhikers that you can introduce to a next water body you go to. And the same goes with terrestrial plants. Good keeping your shoes clean when you come to a new trail or if you're traveling to a new part of the state. Basic things, just seeds that can be really tiny. They can hitchhike and small pieces of dirt on your shoe tread. So just simple things like that can really go a long way to preventing spread.
In addition to, we talked about the choke cherry trees, the Alodia, also the green crab. It sounds like kind of a, we love our crab here in Alaska. I'll let either one of you speak to that. That's also on the invasive species list. How does that affect Alaska?
Yeah, so European green crabs were found maybe a couple years ago off a Net Island, in the Metlakatla Indian Reservation, and what we know about green crabs from other places where they've infested is that they do impact Dungeness crab with a competition for species and prey, as well as preying on small life forms of those. And then they also impact eelgrass beds by digging them up, which is a really important habitat for both salmon and our Dungeness crab. So this one is really relatively new to the state. If you see it anywhere, definitely go to alaskainvasives.org and figure out how to let us know where you find it, and take good pictures and such. We're hoping that we can keep that one at bay and keep it further south, if not our partners further south in BC and Washington can help keep its numbers down too.
Yeah. And when you think of invasive species, sometimes these are harmful to the environment that they're in a new environment. Are there invasive species that have come to Alaska that have actually helped flourish and grow the ecosystem?
Good question. Most of the things I can think of that are more weedy as far as plants goes, and kind of have their benefits in your local environment. Think about things like pineapple weed and common plantain that don't have big impacts towards the natural world and those ecosystems. Those things are, pineapple weed and plantain are kind of medicinal as well as can be made into teas. Um, but yeah, we don't have good information on a ton of real positive impacts. In some instances with flowers, they can start to attract pollinators, and when you attract pollinators to them, they might benefit the plants that are around them, but they might also draw those pollinators away from other things that are further distance from those invasive plants. So it's kind of it gets to be a little bit of a mixed bag, and we always have to think about, like, what is the benefit versus the cost of this plant or animal being out in the environment.
And you mentioned too about if people see things to send in photos. You guys encourage Alaskans, or anyone for that matter, to do that. I guess you'd rather probably have the photo evidence and it not be a threat versus kind of passing it by. Would you guys both kind of speak to that and say that?
Yeah, I love getting and helping people with identification of those things that are out there, and it's always great to see, whatever it happens to be. It's just something new you saw, and like, oh, hey, well, actually, this is like chocolate lily out on the coastal areas, and it's a native plant, so nothing to worry about. But thanks.
Kate, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I have a personal success story I'd share with this invasive species app. I walk the dog by my neighbor's yard every day for years and noticed this knotweed shrub coming in. I've never seen knotweed in girdwood before. I snapped a photo of it. It went to Gino within a year. That sucker was, and we haven't seen it since. But there's other apps if you're new to the flora or more about the organisms that you're finding in the wild. I also strongly recommend the iNaturalist application. It's really easy to upload those, and you get experts telling you, and even the AI on the tool is actually pretty useful to help you identify what you're seeing. And I believe we're starting to use that data as well. If some of these things are invasive, we can pull that in to our invasive database for the state.
Gino, you're kind of shaking your head there. Anything you want to add?
Oh. Yeah, I'm a follower of iNaturalist, so it is one way to kind of get some things to me. I don't follow like every invasive species that comes through. But my interesting ones like European bird cherry, orange hawkweed, the knotweed that Kate mentioned, it sends me an email, iNaturalist, every time somebody in Alaska submits one of those, and I'm able to kind of go look at it and see, like, oh, that one's somewhere where you generally know it is, and if it's not, then I send it off to somebody who works in that area. So.
Well, I'll leave. I'm going to pose one final question as we wrap up this interview. Appreciate your guys' time. So even though Invasive Species Week is this week, June 9th through the 15th, which obviously we're bringing awareness to, this is something I assume that you want Alaskans to kind of be aware of all year round. So I'll let each of you, Gina, I'll start with you, kind of have your final thoughts, any advice or that you want to mention or add in regards to invasive species or that you think is relevant for people to know.
So, besides visiting AlaskaInvasives.org to learn more, and what Kate mentioned about making sure your boots, your gear, your boats, your plane rudders, everything else is kind of clean of vegetation, whether it's native or non-native, can help us prevent those things. One other thing to add is, especially if you're a traveler coming up from the lower 48 states or Canada, if you are coming up with firewood, please leave that firewood behind. Firewood is a big vector of non-native insects, many that are pests that we don't have in the state. And we've all seen what some even native insects like spruce beetle can do to our forests, and we don't need another non-native invasive species coming in and causing damage like that on top of what we already do.
And Kate?
Yeah, I just really appreciate you highlighting this invasive species week, but you're right, the year-round problem for Alaska. But what's special about Alaska, we've got really short growing seasons and large intact ecosystems. And the biggest threats these natural ecosystems are the introductions of really nasty invasive species. So just an ounce of prevention really goes a long way, especially in the state where a majority of our landscape is not impacted by So again, really appreciate highlighting this topic this week.
Absolutely. Well, I learned something new today. So, knowledge is power, right? So we appreciate both of you guys taking the time, again, Gino and Kate, for talking about Alaska Invasive Species Awareness Week. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.